Once upon a time, long ago, in Owo, a town in Ondo State, Nigeria, there lived a couple popularly known as Mr. and Mrs. Ade. Mr. and Mrs. Ade were a loving couple struggling to make ends meet. They were well known in the village for their kindness and generosity, always willing to help the people around them despite their own poverty. The couple had no kids, but they had the niece of Mrs. Ade living with them. Ayo, a 10-year-old girl, lost her parents 5 years ago to a fatal accident, and ever since then, she had been living with Mr. and Mrs. Ade, who had been taking good care of her ever since. Mr. Ade was a farmer, while his wife sold vegetables from their farms in the market. They dreamed of a better life, one where they wouldn't have to worry about their next meal or the roof over their heads. They continued in the struggle until one day their fortunes took a turn for the worse when a severe drought hit the village, causing their crops to fail. With no harvest to sell, the Ades found themselves in dire straits. Desperation led them to seek the help of a herbalist known for his dark rituals. The herbalist promised them wealth and prosperity, but at a terrible cost. The herbalist told them to perform a ritual involving human sacrifice. Mr. and Mrs. Ade were horrified by the idea. "No, we can't do that," shouted Mrs. Ade. "We can't shed innocent lives because of money." Facing her husband, she said, "My husband, let us live here." They left the herbalist with sorrow, and that night they could not sleep. From that day on, things became worse for them, as they could barely even feed themselves and their little niece, Ayo. One day, they both sat down in their empty living room. Mr. Ade turned to Mrs. Ade and told her they had to consider what the herbalist told them, as their situation is not getting any better. "Who are we going to use for this ritual?" Mrs. Ade asked. "Ayo," Mr. Ade said firmly, not maintaining eye contact with the wife. "No way," shouted Mrs. Ade. "When did you become this heartless? I can never harm my only niece," she screamed. "Think about it. We have 3 days to decide," Mr. Ade said, leaving his wife in annoyance. Mrs. Ade succumbed to the pressures her husband is giving her, and they both decided to use Ayo for rituals, unknown to the poor girl. Mr. and Mrs. Ade, who were once horrified by the idea of using the innocent girl, but their dire situation and the promise of a better life eventually eroded their morals. They performed the ritual, after which the herbalist told them to always come to him every 5 years to renew their wealth. He gave them some specific instructions on what to eat and also some warnings. Failure to follow these instructions, they would both run mad. Few days after, they started to experience wealth beyond their wildest dreams, and before the villagers started noticing the disappearance of Ayo, they moved to the city, built a luxurious house, and enjoyed a life of comfort and opulence. But the dark secrets of their wealth gnawed at their conscience, turning them into heartless individuals who would do anything to maintain their newfound status. Meanwhile, in a nearby town, a young woman named Ada was also struggling. Orphaned at a young age, she had been raised by her older brother who worked tirelessly to provide for them. Despite his efforts, they lived in poverty, and Ada had to drop out of school to help with the household chores. She dreamed of a better life where she could go back to school and escape the circle of poverty. One day, Ada's brother heard about a job opportunity in the city. The Ade's family were looking for a housemaid, and the pay was generous. Ada's brother encouraged her to apply, thinking it was a chance for her to earn a decent living and save for her education. Ada was hesitant, but eventually agreed, hoping this job would be the break they needed. When Ada arrived at the Ade residence, she was awestruck by the beauty of the house. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. She was grateful for the opportunity and determined to work hard to repay the kindness of her employers. Little did she know what they had done in the past or what they are capable of doing now. For a month now, Ada worked tirelessly for the Ade family. They treated her not well. They didn't treat her well at all. But she wasn't suffering either. At least, she had enough to eat, and they paid her well for the heavy workload, which left her with very little sleep. Ada wasn't allowed to leave the house for any reason, which bothered her a lot. Whenever she asked Victor, the driver, or Marcus, the gateman, they would shun her and tell her to mind her own business and do as she was told. Ada also noticed that Mr. Ade and his wife, Mrs. Ade, didn't eat certain foods like beef, goat, meat, chicken or fish. They said they preferred eating dog meat and another type of meat that looked like pork, but they never told her what it was. They also didn't eat food cooked with red oil. This puzzled Ada for some time, but she assumed maybe they had health issues that prevented them from eating certain foods. One day, Mrs. Ade brought home a carton of the strange meat. Ada went to work immediately. While washing the meat to steam, she noticed a long bone hidden among the pieces. She was perplexed because the meat was usually boneless and cut into large square pieces. Upon closer inspection, Ada discovered that it was a human finger. Ada felt sick and wanted to vomit. She had been cooking human flesh all this time. Mr. and Mrs. Ade were this mean? She couldn't wrap her head around this fact because they seemed like normal people who couldn't do harm. How could this be? Ada tried to be happy about the fact that she had never tasted the meat, as she always stood her ground to not eat anything she wasn't familiar with. Still, it wasn't enough to leave the guilt of cooking her fellow humans. even though she had done it out of ignorance. Ada decided she had to leave this house, no matter the consequence. Leaving the house wasn't easy, as Ada wasn't allowed to step out for any reason. Her only chance for freedom was to resign, which she informed them about. "Why do you want to resign?" they asked together. "Are we not paying you enough?" They didn't look angry, only worried. Ada couldn't tell them the real reason she wanted to leave the house was that she discovered they were cannibals. She could be their next meal. "I just got a call that my mother is sick," Ada lied. "How sick is she?" Mrs. Ade said, looking at her suspiciously. Ada was sweating profusely. "Very sick, ma. I still have your brother's number, the one who told me about you. I will send some money to him to take care of your mother," Mr. Ade said, taking his phone. "No, sir, don't bother sending any money," Ada said. Mr. Ade looked at her coldly. "I don't understand what's going on here, but you are not leaving this house until your work contract is over in a year. Do you hear me?" He said sternly. Ada was shaking to the bone, and all she could do was nod. Later that day, Ada was in the backyard, raking leaves absent-mindedly because her mind was occupied with so many thoughts. How would she survive cooking human meat with these people? She hit a small stubborn tree stump with the rake. Ada wanted to leave it, but something told her to take it out. So she got a shovel and started digging around the stump to remove the roots with ease. The stump was hard to remove, so she dug further down to get to the main roots. As Ada was digging, she saw something unfamiliar buried in the ground. Her attention switched to a new discovery, and she started digging out the object. Lo and behold, it was a skull that still had rotten flesh on it. Ada pressed her hands to her mouth to stop herself from shouting. A human skull buried in her employer's backyard. Not only were they cannibals, but they were also murderers. After 3 long weeks of hopelessness, Ada's opportunity came. Mrs. Ade was out of town for an event in her village, leaving Ada alone with her husband in the house. Although Victor and Moses were around, they didn't stay in the main house like she did. Mr. Ade called Ada to his library days after Mrs. Ade's departure. He wanted her to go to the market to get some foodstuffs that were running low in the house. Normally, Mrs. Ade did this, but since she wasn't around, Ada was the next option. "Come," he called her back. "Do not even think of escaping. And if you do, make sure I never find you," he warned. His voice sent chills down her spine, and Ada was almost discouraged. Mr. Ade was a dangerous man, that was for sure. Victor took Ada to the market as planned and acted like a bodyguard, which was planned. He followed her everywhere she went. At one point, he held her arm and only released her when a woman misunderstood them as a young couple who couldn't stay a minute without touching each other. Ada tried losing Victor in the crowd by walking fast, but he was an even faster walker. She tried to bore him into leaving by gossiping with the woman selling vegetables, but he didn't leave. Ada got a chance when they got to a busy place with a lot of people. Apparently, people were rushing to watch a group of entertainers singing. People pushed past them, talking loudly as they tried to get to the scene. Ada slipped into the crowd and mixed with the people. She heard Victor's deep voice yelling her name through the noisy crowd, but she never once turned back. Ada didn't know where she was running to because it was her first time at the market. She heard Victor calling out her name. He was so close, and outrunning him was impossible. Ada dashed into a store that sold food items and pleaded with the woman to hide her because her life was in danger, which wasn't far from the truth. The kind woman agreed and hid Ada behind the bags of rice in her shop. Ada stayed in the store for a very long time. The kind woman, whose name Ada learned was Blessing, brought her out of the store. The market was about to close, and Ada couldn't stay there or anywhere in the city because Mr. Ade would surely find her. She didn't have a place to go either because her hometown was far from this state, and she didn't have a kobo with her as her brother was out of town. Ada explained her dilemma to Blessing. She offered to help. She gave her a headscarf that covered her face partially and took her to the closest motor park, paying for her transportation. Even as Ada sat in the safety of the bus, she could still hear Miss Ade's voice. Don't think of escaping. And if you do, make sure I never find you. Ada had escaped, and now she would make sure he never ever found her. Mr. Ade was so angry at Victor for letting Ada out of his sight. He knew Ada knew something about their secret, but he really can't tell what she knew about them specifically. He ordered that Victor and Moses search the whole town for Ada. He also recruited men to look for her, but to no avail. The following week, Mrs. Ade came back from her trip and heard about what happened. We have to get another maid as soon as possible, she said. The ritual renewal is in 3 months. Immediately, he ordered Victor to put a big signpost outside the gate, but days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, and they still could not get anyone. The sacrifice renewal is in a week, and they are still not gotten any maid. The driver and gatesman, Victor and Moses, knew that if Mr. and Mrs. Ade didn't see anyone, they would resort to using them. Only the 2 of them knows about their secret. They recruit mates every 2 months because they end up killing them. One night, Victor and Moses took to their heels, leaving Mr. and Mrs. Ade to dance to their music and face the consequences of their actions. The day of the sacrifice renewal came, and they still haven't gotten anyone. They both ran mad, and people got to know their secrets and using them as a bad example that covetousness would always lead to trouble. The moral lesson from this story is that greed can lead to ruin. The desire for wealth and comfort can cloud one's judgment and lead to destructive decisions. We should also know that there is no shortcut to success. It often requires hard work, perseverance, and integrity. Mr. and Mrs. Ade could have worked hard to improve their financial situations through legal means, but instead they chose to take a shortcut that led to disaster. In the end, their evil acts caught up with them. This serves as a reminder that justice will always prevail, even if it takes time. These moral lessons can be applied to our daily lives by reminding us the importance of integrity, loyalty, honesty, hard work, and perseverance.